It is Sunday, October the 28th, 2018. This is the Dissident Peasant Podcast, and I am your host, Jeff in Georgia. On today's show, Frances Perkins makes our liberals look bad. Part the second, yes, we're going to wrap up New Deal mother Frances Perkins' efforts. The first woman cabinet secretary in the history of the United States, as well as a figure of great historical and cultural importance, regardless of gender. But of course, before I get to that, just a brief reminder. The show is brought to you by people like you, listeners who go to dissidentpeasant.com, who go to patreon.com/dissidentpeasant, who go to paypal.me/dissidentpeasant. You folks are the true heroes. Not to whine, just to give you a little bit of a picture of how I feel and where I'm at. The contributions, I'm very grateful for them, and I really appreciate them, and I do need them. I've noticed that towards the end of every month, I'm always a bit short. Just those few days between the end of the month and the next time I get my Patreon dollars are a little bit tough. So if you want to help me out, you can go to those places I mentioned before. You can go to dissidentpeasant.com. That's always headquarters. You can become a recurring donor at patreon.com/dissidentpeasant. You can go to PayPal. You can leave a one-time donation. And thank you very much. Now, with all that out of the way, on with the show. Now, before I go any further, after last week, there's been something on my mind about Miss Perkins and FDR that I need to clarify. As a matter of near necessity, stories kind of need a protagonist, mostly, and the natural inclination for both author and audience is to sympathize and identify with the protagonist. This is not something I'm going to try to resist here on this show, frankly. But because of this, I've already started to cast two liberals as heroes of the day, in a way. And to be clear with you, I really hate that shit in history books. As if the story of the world post-Enlightenment is the battle between liberals and conservatives. And there have always been numbers to their left and right, respectively, that have been driving factors in the march of history. Basically, FDR and Perkins and others, too. Talented, educated. They would never have gotten anywhere near the reins of power were it not for huge swaths of more radical elements that favored massive changes to the very organization of society and government. Now, because of their proximity to these battered but not erased socialist and communist movements, they will actually do a fair job at it, I think. Finally, all this is probably more true of FDR than Perkins. FDR, literally derided as a class traitor for years, was from money and pedigree, much more so than Perkins, and was the one actually running for elections. Perkins never sought nor served in any elected office her entire life, as far as I can tell, and she's our real hero for the day. She who may not have come from nothing, but had seen up close and personally those who had, and was determined to try to do something about it. Anyway, speaking of that hero, when we last left her, she was following FDR to Washington to pursue that agenda I outlined last episode in March of 1933, inauguration time. What was the country like at that moment? Well, by this time, the Hoover administration had signed off on the Smoot-Hawley tariffs in 1930 in an effort to protect farmers wiped out by the Dust Bowl, a natural catastrophe which wouldn't completely end until the decade itself would, by the by. The actual consequence of these tariffs was the raising of food prices at a time when ongoing agricultural devastation and economic depression were making it hard enough to get enough to eat for millions. To make matters worse, Hoover raised taxes basically on his way out the door in 1932, not soaking the rich, but jacking things up across the board. All this had contributed to some of the highest unemployment numbers ever recorded in the United States. The national unemployment rate was approaching 25% in 1932, and GDP declined nearly 13% that year, after 2 previous years of sharp contraction. Huey Long, the quixotic authoritarian populist from Louisiana, who had supported Roosevelt for president, was running strong. At this point, he had all his allies in key positions of power in the state, had called out the National Guard to prevent a rival and enemy from taking the governor's chair, and became the senator from Louisiana that same year. He would soon debut his Share the Wealth plan, which even contemporary socialists regarded as insanely unworkable in its detail, but which promised every American family a cool $5,000 a year in 1934 dollars, free college, old age pensions, veterans benefits, public works, a month's vacation for every worker, and a 30-hour work week. Good goals, certainly, and perhaps even technically achievable, but not with the sorts of tax and enforcement mechanisms and whatnot Long had vaguely sketched out. Assassinated in 1935, Long was a complicated and corrupt character, and certainly no socialist or communist, nor friend to any, I think. But he certainly smelled the change in the air as cannily as any other politician did, and was looking to stake out ground to Roosevelt's left. His Share the Wealth clubs would gather around 7.5 million members by the year of his death. Father Coughlin was getting big too. He and Long got along personally and were aligned politically, I've read. The Catholic priest and talk radio host. In 1932, he was a Roosevelt man as well, though in time this anti-communist would turn his back on FDR as too friendly with workers. But for now, he was railing about the greed of manufacturers and a famine of money gripping the United States. He supported Long and his platform before his assassination, and supported work and income guarantees and some other stuff in the Longian flavor through his, and I'm not kidding, National Union for Social Justice. Father Coughlin, social justice warrior. Go figure. Who else was running about with radical ideas on wealth redistribution? On the more ordinary side, Francis Townsend would get his clubs up and running that September. The retired doctor and public health officer had proposed every person over the age of 60 $200 a month, funded by a national sales tax of 2%, with the stipulations that they had to be retired, free from, quote, habitual criminality. Yeah, I don't know. And that they had to spend the money within 30 days of receipt. Even retired doctors in the 30s were grasping towards Keynesianism, it seems. Norman Thomas, the socialist, pacifist, and 6-time presidential candidate, was also running about. As a fascinating aside, after Eugene V. Debs' death in 1926, because the party's top 2 members were of foreign birth and thus ineligible to be president, and the only other guy of note, Daniel Hone, was busy being mayor of Milwaukee, this little-known New York Presbyterian minister was at the helm of the Socialist Party. Indefatigable, brilliant, and one whose principled pacifism he will come to regret. He is a good reminder to me that it's not always about how many people listen to you, but who does the listening. Because FDR and Perkins, too, clearly paid a great deal of attention to Thomas. When FDR railed to aides that, quote, I am fighting communism, Huey Longism, Coughlinism, Townsendism. Socialism or Thomasism is conspicuously absent from the list. That's not to say Roosevelt was allied with Thomas, just to say that he probably considered them in a category ripe for co-option and not defeat. Lastly, speaking of American communists, for those who are wondering how that banner was faring at the time, they were just coming off a huge blow. Stalin has declared any Western socialist or communist parties social fascists and refused to work with them or collaborate with them in any way. Early 1932 was a low point in this dynamic, and the socialists actually surpassed them in dues-paying members that year. However, the coming years would ultimately bring with it some enthusiasts. Disillusioned with capitalism, enthusiasts impressed by the Soviet Union's early opposition to fascism in Spain and Germany, and enthusiasts impressed by the party's commitment to racial equality, as Paul Robeson and Helen Keller both would surely have me remind you. Into this nationwide maelstrom stepped Frances Perkins. Now, I hope you'll forgive all the context about so many people who weren't Miss Perkins, and I haven't stooped only to dryly reciting facts and figures. But you really need know that those who describe Perkins as some sort of liberal radical are telling half a lie, at least. I see her as really the inheritor of Thomas Paine's unfulfilled visions of a society that really put its money where its mouth was, in terms of fostering individual human achievement. Because to really give that a fair go, everyone needs to have a robust and sturdy floor to start from, and those who stumble should be afforded dignity and a lifestyle worthy of such an enlightened and prosperous land as America. But to refocus the lens, spring of 1933 was a time of emergency, and it was all hands on deck. I'll not dwell on Roosevelt's immediate legislation to shore up the banking sector, which was completely paralyzed on Inauguration Day. In fact, all 48 states ordered their banks closed. Roosevelt directed Perkins to deliver him a plan to deliver relief at a time when people were literally starving to death. And she did. The Federal Emergency Relief Act of 1933, appropriately named, begins, quote, an act to provide for cooperation by the federal government with the several states and territories and the District of Columbia in relieving the hardship and suffering caused by unemployment and for other purposes. Being enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America and Congress assembled, that the Congress hereby declares that the present economic depression has created a serious emergency due to widespread unemployment and increasing inadequacy of state and local relief funds, resulting in the existing or threatened deprivation of a considerable number of families and individuals of the necessities of life, and making it imperative that the federal government cooperate more effectively with the several states and territories and the District of Columbia in furnishing relief to their needy and distressed people. End quote. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration and the Civilian Conservation Corps were the first time Uncle Sam, and not one of his ill-gotten children known as states, delivered public relief to Americans himself. From its inception that May 1933 till its dissolution in 1935, replaced and reorganized, not abolished, this administration, headed by Perkins-picked Harry Hopkins, provided work for over 20 million people, separate from CCC numbers. In addition, just to summarize some of what happened quite rapidly during the first 100 days with Perkins, FDR effectively removed the U.S. from the gold standard, ended prohibition on alcohol and taxed its sale, got the Tennessee Valley Authority rolling, provided loans and refinancing to farms and homes. 20% of all mortgages on property in urban areas were refinanced by Uncle Sam by 1935. He separated commercial and retail banking from investment banking, started the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, outlawed child labor, set the workday at 8 hours, set minimum wages for these public works jobs, recognized unions' legal bargaining rights, and funded yet more public works projects through either superseding or parallel agencies to those I've already described. Big changes, certainly. And while there were those who were ready to call FDR a socialist basically no matter what he did after taking office, and these programs were derided by some as just that, millions more derided these as half measures by some of these groups and sympathizers thereof on Perkins's left flank, as sketched out earlier for you. Therefore, Perkins wasn't finished. The New Deal's more emergency projects would continue apace: more public works, rural electrification, public housing, and these would arrest economic decline before the war did, regardless of what anyone else tells you about that, frankly, though the government would cut public spending far too quickly for the gains to compound upon themselves much. Notably, one of Perkins's first tasks as Labor Secretary was to shut down something called Section 24, part of the Immigration Department, and at the time under the purview of the Labor Secretary. Section 24 was conducting high-profile immigration raids and harassing aliens. Perkins disbanded it. Perkins had her fingers in plenty of pies at the time, no doubt. But probably her most important contribution was to become chairwoman of the President's Committee on Economic Security, for it was this body that would create what would become the most durable and successful anti-poverty program the United States has ever enjoyed: Social Security. Quote, "I've always said, and I still think we have to admit, that no matter how much fine reasoning there was about the old age insurance system and the unemployment insurance prospects, no matter how many people were studying it, or how many committees had ideas on the subject, or how many college professors had written theses on the subject, and there were an awful lot of them, the real roots of the Social Security Act were in the Great Depression of 1929. Nothing else would have bumped the American people into a social security system except something so shocking, so terrifying as that depression." End quote. So Perkins once wrote. Now, the original goal was to create a comprehensive program: workers' compensation, health insurance, disability, unemployment compensation, old age benefits, survivors' benefits, family benefits, and maternity benefits. Now, obviously, not all or even most of this will make it in right now. Indeed, some of these, public and national health insurance, for example, we continue to struggle for even today. What's more, increasing Social Security's scope or payouts is not only not on the table presently, but those payments themselves have grown ever more stingy with time, even as the right wing is increasingly vocal about its wants to privatize or shrink the program. Still, limited as it was still an achievement, and a step in the evolution of Perkins and America itself, probably. Writing from the early 30s from Perkins and her allies often speaks of the necessity of having an assured job in order to truly enjoy economic freedom and security in America. And that's well enough, certainly. No one who works for a living should live in poverty. But what of those who cannot work due to disability or lack of opportunity or age? Some people thought perhaps that a sufficiently healthy and rich society of high wages and economic security would consequently be more charitable, and that state support for such non-laborers was unneeded. Well, it was needed, and is still. But the act was opposed as both too little and too much, slimmed down as it was. Some of the opposition was based on its lack of immediate payments to the elderly. This is the Townsend people, of course. Others, its exemptions for nurses, teachers, agricultural workers, hospital employees, government employees, domestic workers, and others, which meant that the program tended to cover white males and women and black people not so much. You'll generally hear that these exemptions were carved out to appease racist elements of the Democratic Party, in Congress mostly, not among the president's appointees to this commission. You might also hear that some of these exemptions for housemaids and farm employees, for example, were made because setting up payroll deduction for such people would be too difficult. For my part, I don't doubt that there were some technical hurdles that may have encouraged some of these exemptions, but I cannot imagine that the decision to exclude professions which were dominated by women and black people was some sort of inadvertent consequence of technical reasoning. It was easier to exclude them because it was hard to include them, but the reason Uncle Sam didn't bother to try harder to include them is because of their race and gender. It is not a lie, therefore, that women and black people, among others, were excluded from Social Security provisions early on because they were women and black people, not because they happened to do jobs it was harder to do payroll deductions for. Social Security, of course, has been greatly expanded since its creation, but it has never reached its true potential, in my opinion. This is a mechanism already set up that we could very easily use to abolish poverty itself in the United States by and large, and I am not exaggerating. And even after its immediate creation, this was recognized. In particular, one common worry at the time was that benefits to widows and women generally were so low that they were forcing these women back into the labor force when they didn't want to be. Now, the nitty-gritty of how Social Security has been amended many times, I will not get into here, but I will tell you what Perkins herself said about it, quote, "And then began the great problem which you have taken over, the administration of this act. Thousands of new problems arose in the administration which had not been foreseen by those who did the planning and the legal drafting. Of course, the act had to be amended, and has been amended, and amended, and amended, and amended, until it has now grown into a large and important project, for which, by the way, I think the people of the United States are deeply thankful. One thing I know, Social Security is so firmly embedded in the American psychology today that no politician, no political party, no political group could possibly destroy this act and still maintain our democratic system. It is safe. It is safe forever, and for the everlasting benefit of the people of the United States." End quote. With due respect to Ms. Perkins, of course, I disagree. All around me, I see solidarity and shared experiences breaking down, the consequence of our atomized existences and technological changes that keep us both more and less connected. W tried to come for Social Security in the aughts. And even now, as a consequence of budget deficits they themselves created with enormous tax cuts for rich people, Republicans are murmuring about reducing benefits further. Surely a step on the way towards privatization. As an aside, rather than its evolution into another wealth extractive device is far more likely for Social Security, I think. Either way, it isn't safe. It seemed that way at the time, because there were huge swaths of people who sat to Perkins's left, who clamored for Social Security to be less stingy, more universal, more socialist in a sense. Now, I don't think those people have diminished too much in number when compared to the New Deal era, but neither do I think their voices nearly as loud and compelling as they were in the 30s. I am not inclined to blame the left for this too harshly, whatever responsibility or tactical errors they made from then to now. Rather, the incredibly effective and massive effort by right-wing money to dominate media, among other efforts, is probably a bigger cause. In any case, to return to the narrative a bit, 1935 brings the beginning of the Popular Front days for communists, meaning that, by and large, these people became overridingly concerned with the rise of fascism in Germany, especially after Hitler made it clear that he considered the Soviet Union a mortal enemy after taking power. Domestically, it meant that a good deal of the immediate heat from the left flank was taken off. From the right, in 1938, some in Congress actually tried to impeach her for her decision not to deport an alleged communist longshoreman organizer before his case was concluded in the courts, and she was hauled in front of the House Judiciary Committee. Now, this committee issued a unanimous report finding no grounds for impeachment, but also included another section for various committee members to grumble and gripe that Perkins was some sort of communist rat. Press accounts seized upon this section and left the impression in the minds of many that she had actually been condemned by the committee. She had not, and what's more, FDR stood by her through it all. For what it's worth, the longshoreman in question was never determined to be an undesirable alien and was never deported. Still, after this incident, her star fades a bit. During the war, her most important efforts were probably those that resulted in New Deal labor standards being upheld, even at a time of goods and labor shortage, for which the nation then and now owes her a tremendous debt for largely holding Uncle Sam's promises good, when the feelings of emergency the war brought may have ruined everything very easily. Perkins would remain the Labor Secretary until shortly before FDR's death in 1945. Upon taking office, Vice President, now President Harry Truman, immediately asked her to chair the United States Civil Service Commission, which she accepted. Her husband, Paul, died in 1952, and it is this occasion that prompts Perkins to finally leave behind her public career for the first time since the 1900s. She would continue to write, travel, and lecture after this before suffering a stroke in 1965. Today, she lies beside her husband, Paul, in Newcastle, Maine. People often credit FDR with saving capitalism from itself, from socialism, from fascism, from communism. He does deserve some credit, but in the domestic sphere, Perkins deserves it more. Her programs that were derided as both too socialist and not socialist enough, her standards that were derided as both too strict and not strict enough, her goals that were fulfilled and her goals that were not. Was Frances Perkins a radical compared to the shittier liberals and conservatives of her day? Undoubtedly so. Compared to the socialists and communists on her left flank? Undoubtedly not. Perkins herself was cognizant that her work was not the end, that her standards and positions were not golden rules, never to be toppled or altered. Quote, "There is always a large horizon. There is much to be done. I am not going to be doing it. It is up to you to contribute some small part to a program of human betterment for all time," she said. But the very idea that this should be the job of Uncle Sam, not the states, not a paternalistic company, not the whims of charitable actors, but Uncle Sam. She probably deserves more credit than any single person for advancing that view in American history. So it is to our shame, and not hers, that the work week remains fixed at 40 hours, that no basic income program has been rolled out through Social Security's mechanisms, that its old age benefits are too small to live comfortably on, that work towards universal public health insurance is undone, that jobs like warehouse worker can require the wearing of diapers in order to avoid bathroom breaks and constant surveillance, and so on. For many liberals, to be in the center of political discourse, left and right wings to the sides, is a good in and of itself. How else to be more reasonable and moderate than the next person? For a smarter kind of liberal like Perkins that doesn't hold reasonableness and moderation to be virtues themselves, that tightrope walk was not for its own glory, but towards progress. Progress that shouldn't stop and pat itself on the back for every achievement made on the road to building a country that can call itself just and generous, but marches ever onward, limited only by the imagination of that country's citizens. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your support. Patreon.com/DistantPeasant, PayPal.me/DistantPeasant. Go there, contribute if you want to. What am I going to have next time? I don't know. Halloween's coming up. I don't know what could be spookier or more terrifying than the Union Army freeing all the slaves. Woo! So maybe I'll do something like that or something else. I don't know. But stay tuned. There will definitely be something. Alright, love you, fam.